A daughter should never hear the price placed upon her soul. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Whitmore Manor, while thunder rolled across the distant hills like the warning of an approaching judgment. Inside the dimly lit study, Rosalie Whitmore stood silently beyond the half-open door, her trembling fingers clutching the edge of her wool shawl as voices rose inside the room. The smell of cigar smoke and wet leather filled the air. Her uncle, Theodore Whitmore, paced before the fireplace with the restless desperation of a man cornered by his own sins. Across from him stood two stern men dressed in black overcoats, their polished boots dripping rainwater onto the Persian rug. "The dead is due tomorrow night," one of them said coldly. "His Grace has shown patience long enough." Theodore wiped sweat from his brow despite the winter chill crawling through the old manor walls. "You don't understand," he snapped. "The church accounts will recover after spring donations arrive." The taller man gave a humorless smile. "Duke Ashford is not known for charitable delays." At the mention of that name, Rosalie's breath caught softly in her throat. Sebastian Ashford, the Duke of Blackthorne. Even in the quiet countryside, stories about him traveled like shadows through candlelit parlors. A widowed nobleman with a frozen heart. A man who had not smiled in years. Some claimed grief had turned him cruel. Others whispered that loneliness had made him dangerous. Rosalie had never seen him. Until tonight, she had prayed she never would. Her uncle suddenly stopped pacing. His tired eyes darkened with something desperate. Something ugly. "Take the girl instead," he muttered. Silence swallowed the room. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. Rosalie felt the blood drain from her face. "My niece," Theodore continued, his voice shaking now. "Rosalie is young, educated, and beautiful. Any duke would find value in her." One of the men slowly lifted an eyebrow. "You would offer your own blood as payment?" Theodore swallowed hard. "Only until the debt is forgiven." Rosalie's knees weakened beneath her. For one terrible moment, she could not breathe. The grandfather clock in the corridor ticked softly behind her like the countdown to a sentence already decided. She had endured many humiliations since her father's death 2 years earlier. Poverty, gossip, endless sacrifices made quietly behind lowered eyes. But never this. Never being spoken of as though she were furniture to be exchanged between men. Her fingers unconsciously moved toward the small silver cross hanging at her throat. It had belonged to her mother once. The only precious thing she had left. "Does the girl know?" the taller man asked. Theodore laughed bitterly. "She knows her duty." Rosalie closed her eyes. Duty. That word had followed her like a ghost her entire life. Duty to family. Duty to faith. Duty to survive with grace no matter how cruel the world became. A floorboard creaked softly beneath her shoe. The conversation inside stopped instantly. Theodore yanked the study door open with visible irritation, only for his expression to harden when he saw her standing there pale and motionless in the candlelight. Rainwater shimmered across the windows behind him while shadows stretched across his aging face. "Rosalie," he said sharply, "come inside." She obeyed because she had been taught obedience long before she understood fear. The two strangers studied her openly now. Rosalie kept her chin lifted despite the humiliation burning beneath her skin. She would not cry before them. Theodore gestured toward her with forced pride. "You see," he said quietly, "she is refined, well-mannered. She will not cause trouble for his grace." Rosalie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are sending me away?" Theodore refused to meet her eyes. "This is the only way to save the family." Outside, thunder cracked violently across the dark sky. And somewhere far beyond the storm, Blackthorne Hall waited for her like the mouth of a sleeping beast. The journey to Blackthorne Hall began before sunrise beneath a sky the color of ash. Rosalie sat silently inside the swaying carriage while cold rain streaked the windows beside her like tears the heavens themselves refused to hide. The road stretched endlessly through barren fields and skeletal trees stripped bare by winter. Across from her, one of the Duke's men slept with his hat tilted low over his eyes, while the other occasionally glanced toward her with unreadable pity. Rosalie folded her gloved hands tightly in her lap to stop their trembling. She had packed only one small leather case, 2 dresses, her mother's silver cross, a prayer book worn soft at the corners. Everything else she owned remained behind at Whitmore Manor like pieces of a life already buried. The carriage wheels struck a rut, throwing her slightly sideways. She steadied herself quietly and looked out at the storm-dark horizon. Somewhere ahead waited a man she had never met. A man who now possessed the right to decide her future. Fear settled heavily in her chest, but beneath it lived something sharper. Humiliation. Her uncle had not even tried to protect her. He had offered her away with the same desperation a drowning man used to throw cargo overboard. Rosalie closed her eyes briefly. She remembered her father's voice from years ago, warm and gentle beside the fireplace. A person's worth is not decided by those who use them, Rosie. The memory hurt more than the cold. By midday, snow began falling in slow drifting sheets that swallowed the countryside in white silence. The horses struggled against the worsening weather while the wind rattled the carriage walls hard enough to make the lantern overhead flicker. "We may stop for the night if the roads worsen," one of the men muttered. The other shook his head. "His Grace expects us before midnight." His Grace. They spoke the title carefully, almost cautiously, as though even miles away the Duke's presence demanded obedience. Rosalie studied their expressions. Neither man seemed cruel. Yet both carried the same quiet tension she had seen in servants preparing for a storm they could not control. As darkness approached, the snowfall thickened into a blizzard. The world beyond the carriage disappeared completely beneath swirling white shadows. Rosalie pulled her wool coat tighter around herself, but the cold still slipped through every layer. Her fingers had long since gone numb. At last the carriage slowed sharply. One of the men pushed aside the curtain and peered into the storm. "We are close now." Rosalie leaned slightly toward the window. Through the snow she saw it at last. Blackthorne Hall rose from the cliffs like something carved from the night itself. Vast stone towers loomed against the frozen sky, while narrow windows glowed faintly with candlelight. The estate looked less like a home and more like an ancient fortress guarding old grief behind locked walls. The iron gates creaked open slowly as the carriage passed through. Rosalie's heartbeat quickened painfully beneath her ribs. Somewhere inside that enormous shadowed manor waited Sebastian Ashford, the man people feared in whispers, the man her uncle believed could be satisfied with ownership of another human soul. The carriage finally stopped beneath the towering entrance steps. Snow whipped violently around the horses while servants hurried forward carrying lanterns through the storm. One of the Duke's men opened the carriage door and extended his hand. Rosalie stepped down carefully, her boots sinking into several inches of fresh snow. Freezing wind caught her cloak immediately, nearly pulling it from her shoulders. She lifted her eyes toward the entrance of Blackthorne Hall. A tall figure stood motionless beneath the golden light spilling from the open doors. Broad shoulders, black coat, silver threaded through dark hair at the temples. Even from a distance, there was something unnervingly still about him, like a man who had forgotten how to belong among the living. Sebastian Ashford watched her without speaking while snow gathered silently across the stone steps between them. The wind howled across the cliffs as Rosalie climbed the stone steps toward Blackthorne Hall, each gust tugging at her cloak like unseen hands trying to pull her back into the storm. The servants hurried around her carrying trunks and lanterns, but the man waiting beneath the entrance arch remained perfectly still. Sebastian Ashford did not move forward to greet her. He simply watched. Candlelight from the grand foyer cast long shadows across his face, sharpening the severe lines of his jaw and the exhaustion lingering behind his steel-gray eyes. Up close, he looked older than the rumors had described. Not weak, not broken, simply tired in a way sleep could never cure. Rosalie lowered her gaze respectfully as she stopped several feet before him. Snow melted slowly along the edges of her boots, while silence stretched between them. At last the Duke spoke. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was low and controlled, carrying none of the hunger or amusement she had feared hearing from a man expecting ownership of another person. Rosalie forced herself to answer steadily. "Your Grace." His eyes briefly moved over her face, her damp hair, the thin gloves failing to hide how badly her hands trembled from the cold. Yet there was nothing improper in the way he looked at her. Only observation. Careful. Distant. One of the men accompanying her stepped forward quickly and produced a folded document from inside his coat. "The agreement signed by Theodore Whitmore," he announced. "The debt transfer and conditions are enclosed." Sebastian took the papers without a word. The storm roared outside while servants quietly closed the massive oak doors behind them, shutting out the snow and wind. Warm air from enormous fireplaces wrapped around Rosalie instantly, yet she could not stop shivering. Her heart pounded so violently she feared everyone in the hall could hear it. The Duke unfolded the document slowly beneath the chandelier light. Rosalie stared at the marble floor, unable to bear watching the moment her fate officially became property inked onto paper. Seconds passed, then another. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Sebastian spoke again. "Your uncle signed this willingly?" The servant nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." Sebastian's expression hardened almost imperceptibly as his eyes continued down the page. "And he believed I requested this arrangement? He believed Your Grace would find it acceptable compensation." Something cold flickered through the Duke's face then. Not desire. Disgust. Rosalie looked up before she could stop herself. For the first time, their eyes met fully. There was no cruelty there. No satisfaction. Only a deep weariness sharpened by restrained anger. Sebastian folded the papers once. Then, without warning, he stepped toward the nearest fireplace and tossed the entire document directly into the flames. Gasps echoed softly through the entrance hall. Fire curled hungrily across the parchment, while Theodore Whitmore's signature blackened and disappeared into ash. Rosalie stood frozen in shock. One of the servants took an uncertain step forward. "Your Grace." Sebastian never looked away from the fire. No debt grants ownership over a human life. His voice remained calm, but every word struck with quiet finality. "Tell Theodore Whitmore his financial obligations remain entirely his own." The servant paled visibly. "But sir, the agreement is ashes." Sebastian turned at last. His gaze settled briefly on Rosalie again, softer now though no less unreadable. "Miss Whitmore is not payment for anything." Rosalie's throat tightened painfully. She had prepared herself for humiliation, for fear, perhaps even cruelty hidden beneath noble manners. But not this. Never this. For one fragile moment, warmth touched a place inside her that had gone cold long ago. Sebastian removed his glove slowly, exhaustion returning to his expression like a shadow reclaiming familiar ground. "The roads are impassable tonight," he said quietly. "You will remain here until the storm passes." Rosalie opened her mouth, but no words came. Because standing inside that vast haunted manor while snow battered the windows beyond the stone walls, she realized something impossible. The man everyone feared might be the only person who had looked at her all evening and seen a human being instead of a debt. Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper of Blackthorne Hall, led Rosalie through corridors so vast and silent they felt more like the halls of a cathedral than a home. Candlelight flickered against dark stone walls while portraits of long-dead nobles watched from gilded frames with solemn expressions that seemed to follow her every step. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage against the windows, but inside the manor another kind of storm lingered beneath the stillness. Rosalie could feel it in the hushed voices of servants passing through distant corridors, in the way no one spoke above a whisper, in the strange emptiness surrounding such a grand estate. "His Grace rarely receives guests," Mrs. Aldridge explained quietly as they climbed a sweeping staircase lined with iron lanterns. "Especially during winter." Rosalie lowered her eyes politely. "I will not be any trouble." The older woman glanced at her then, and something softened briefly in her tired face. "I do not believe you are the sort who causes trouble, miss." They reached the eastern wing at last. Mrs. Aldridge opened a heavy oak door, revealing a beautiful bedroom warmed by a crackling fireplace. Deep burgundy curtains framed tall windows overlooking the snow-covered cliffs beyond the estate. Fresh candles glowed softly beside a copper wash basin, while folded nightclothes had already been placed carefully at the foot of the bed. Rosalie stopped in silent surprise. "These rooms belonged to guests once," Mrs. Aldridge said, "before the manor became quieter." Her voice faded on the final word. Rosalie stepped farther inside. The warmth of the room slowly thawed her frozen hands, yet unease still lingered heavily inside her chest. Nothing about this place matched the terrible stories whispered about Sebastian Ashford. A cruel man would not have prepared warm clothes for a frightened stranger. A heartless man would not have destroyed the agreement binding her to humiliation. Yet there was sadness here, deep enough to settle into the walls themselves. Mrs. Aldridge approached the fireplace and adjusted another log into the flames. "Dinner will be brought shortly," she said. His Grace prefers privacy in the evenings. Rosalie hesitated before asking softly, "Has the Duke always lived alone?" The housekeeper's hands paused briefly. "Not always." She said nothing more after that. Once the door closed behind her, silence returned completely. Rosalie moved slowly toward the window overlooking the storm outside. Snow swirled violently across the cliffs while black waves crashed against the rocks far below. The isolation of Blackthorne Hall suddenly felt immense, like a kingdom standing at the edge of the world. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared into the darkness beyond the glass. She should have felt relieved, safe, even. Instead, uncertainty twisted painfully inside her. Why had Sebastian Ashford helped her? Men with power rarely acted without expecting something in return. Yet when he looked at her downstairs, there had been no calculation in his eyes, only anger on her behalf. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. Rosalie turned quickly as a young maid entered carrying a silver tray with hot soup, fresh bread, and steaming tea. His Grace instructed the kitchens to prepare something warm immediately, the maid said nervously while setting the tray near the fire. Rosalie blinked in surprise. "The Duke said that." "Yes, miss." The girl gave a small curtsy before hurrying toward the door. Then she paused. "No one has stayed in this wing for nearly 5 years." Rosalie's brow furrowed softly. "Why?" The maid swallowed. "Because after Lady Evelyn died, His Grace closed most of the manor." The door shut quietly behind her. Rosalie stood motionless beside the fire. Lady Evelyn. The name lingered in the room like a ghost. Slowly, Rosalie sat near the flames and lifted the teacup into trembling hands. Beyond the windows, snow buried the world deeper beneath white silence. Somewhere else inside Blackthorne Hall, Sebastian Ashford walked through darkened corridors carrying memories heavy enough to empty an entire home. And for reasons she could not yet understand, he had chosen to let a stranger remain within those shadows. Rosalie slept little that night. The storm battered Blackthorne Hall until dawn, rattling the ancient windows and sending shadows trembling across the walls of her room whenever lightning flashed beyond the cliffs. Several times she woke believing she had heard footsteps outside her door, slow and measured, only for silence to return moments later. By morning the blizzard had buried the estate beneath nearly 3 feet of snow. The world outside had vanished completely beneath white emptiness. Mrs. Aldridge informed her gently during breakfast that no carriage could travel for several days. "The North Road has disappeared beneath the drifts," the housekeeper explained while pouring tea beside the fire. "You are quite stranded here for now, miss." Rosalie accepted the news with quiet composure, though uncertainty tightened painfully inside her. She did not belong in a place like Blackthorne Hall. Every polished hallway reminded her of the distance between herself and the man who owned this vast, lonely estate. Yet despite the strangeness surrounding her, no one treated her with cruelty. If anything, the servants seemed oddly protective, watching her with cautious curiosity whenever she passed. Later that afternoon, unable to endure the suffocating stillness of her room any longer, Rosalie wandered carefully through the eastern corridors while snow drifted against the tall windows beside her. The manor seemed endless. Candlelit galleries stretched into silence, while grandfather clocks ticked softly like distant heartbeats. Most doors remained shut beneath layers of dust untouched for years. It felt less like a home than a monument built around grief. As Rosalie turned down a narrow corridor lined with covered furniture, she noticed one door standing slightly open at the very end. Warm firelight flickered faintly through the gap. Hesitating only briefly, she approached. The room beyond was unlike the dark halls surrounding it. Shelves of leather-bound books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, while a large fireplace glowed softly against polished mahogany floors. Heavy curtains framed enormous windows overlooking the frozen sea below. Yet it was not the beauty of the library that caught Rosalie's attention. It was the portrait hanging above the mantel. A woman looked down from the painting with gentle blue eyes and chestnut hair gathered elegantly beneath a cream silk ribbon. Her smile was soft, alive, the kind of smile that warmed an entire room without effort. Rosalie stepped closer almost unconsciously. Lady Evelyn. She knew it immediately. There was love in the portrait, not merely admiration from the artist, but devotion. The entire room seemed shaped around the memory of the woman in that frame. A book lay open beside the armchair near the fire, as though someone had left only moments earlier. Fresh logs burned quietly in the hearth. This room was still used. You should not be here. Rosalie turned sharply at the sound of Sebastian Ashford's voice behind her. He stood in the doorway dressed in a dark wool coat, one gloved hand still resting against the doorframe. His expression revealed nothing, yet tension lingered beneath the calmness in his eyes. Rosalie immediately stepped back. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was exploring and did not realize this room was private." Sebastian remained silent for a moment. Snowlight from the windows cast pale silver across his face, sharpening the exhaustion beneath his eyes. "Most rooms in this house are private now," he said quietly. Rosalie lowered her gaze. "I did not mean disrespect." Another long silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Sebastian walked past her toward the fireplace. His eyes lifted briefly toward the portrait above the mantel. Something changed in his expression then. Not pain exactly. Something deeper. The ache of a wound that had healed incorrectly. "Her name was Evelyn," he said at last. Rosalie looked up carefully. His voice carried none of the cold restraint he usually wore like armor. Only quiet fatigue. "She loved this library," he continued softly. "She claimed books made empty houses feel less lonely." The fire crackled between them. Rosalie glanced once more toward the smiling woman in the portrait. Suddenly Blackthorne Hall made sense to her. The silence. The closed wings. The emptiness living beneath every polished surface. This was not the home of a cruel man. It was the home of someone who had once loved deeply enough to be ruined by losing it. The storm finally weakened 3 days later, though heavy snow still blanketed the cliffs surrounding Blackthorne Hall in endless white silence. By then Rosalie had learned the strange rhythm of the manor. The servants moved carefully through its halls like people afraid to disturb sleeping ghosts. Entire wings remained untouched behind locked doors while candlelight flickered through only a handful of occupied rooms after sunset. And always, somewhere within those vast stone walls, Sebastian Ashford walked alone. Rosalie rarely saw him during the day, yet evidence of his quiet presence appeared everywhere. Fresh wood placed beside her fireplace before dawn. A thicker wool coat left outside her chamber after the temperature dropped below freezing. Once, after she coughed during breakfast, herbal tea arrived within minutes though she had requested nothing. He never mentioned these gestures himself. He simply noticed. That evening, Blackthorne Hall hosted its first guests since Rosalie's arrival. The neighboring Hawthorne family had become stranded nearby after attempting to return from London before the storm fully cleared. Sebastian had reluctantly offered them shelter for supper in the night. Rosalie realized immediately that the manor itself seemed uneasy about visitors. Servants hurried nervously through the dining hall while additional candles illuminated the enormous table for the first time in years. Crystal glasses reflected golden light across polished silver while snow continued drifting against the tall windows beyond. Mrs. Aldridge adjusted Rosalie's sleeves gently before dinner. "You are not required to attend if you feel uncomfortable," she said softly. Rosalie glanced toward her reflection in the mirror. The dark green gown provided for her fit simply but elegantly against her slender frame. "His Grace has shown me kindness," she replied quietly. "I should not hide from his guests like something shameful." The older woman's eyes softened sadly. "No, miss," she whispered. "You should not." When Rosalie entered the dining hall later that evening, conversation faltered almost immediately. Lord and Lady Hawthorne sat beside their 2 grown daughters near the center of the table, their expensive jewels glimmering beneath the chandeliers. All 4 stared openly at Rosalie as she approached her seat. Sebastian sat at the head of the table dressed entirely in black, his expression unreadable. Yet his eyes briefly lifted toward Rosalie the moment she entered the room. "Miss Whitmore," he said simply. She inclined her head politely before taking the empty chair several places down from him. The meal began in strained silence broken only by the soft clink of silverware against china. Then Lady Hawthorne smiled with practiced sweetness that somehow felt colder than the storm outside. "We were quite surprised to hear Blackthorne Hall had acquired a guest," she remarked lightly, "especially such a young one." One of her daughters gave a quiet laugh behind her wineglass. Rosalie kept her posture calm despite heat rising beneath her skin. Sebastian continued cutting his food without reacting. "Miss Whitmore was caught in the storm," he replied evenly. Nothing more. Of course, Lady Hawthorne said smoothly. Though society has been whispering all sorts of curious things regarding Theodore Whitmore's debts. The second daughter leaned slightly forward. They say his niece was offered in exchange for repayment. The words struck the table like shattered glass. Rosalie felt every eye in the room settle upon her. Shame crawled coldly through her chest, but she forced herself not to lower her gaze. She would not break in front of strangers. Lady Hawthorne sighed dramatically. How tragic for a respectable young woman. Silence followed. Long, heavy. Then Sebastian Ashford slowly placed his silverware beside his plate. The quiet sound echoed through the hall louder than thunder. He lifted his eyes toward Lady Hawthorne with terrifying calmness. Miss Whitmore is under my protection while she remains in this house. His voice remained low, yet every word carried absolute authority. And I would advise extreme care regarding how her name is spoken at my table. The room went still. Even the fire seemed to quiet itself. Rosalie stared at him in stunned silence, while Lady Hawthorne's face paled beneath the chandelier light. Sebastian reached calmly for his wineglass, as though nothing unusual had happened. But for the first time since arriving at Blackthorne Hall, Rosalie understood something dangerous. The Duke's silence was not weakness. It was restraint. After the Hawthorne family departed the following morning, an uneasy quiet settled over Blackthorne Hall once more. Snow still covered the cliffs in pale silver beneath the weak winter sun, but inside the manor the warmth felt strangely fragile, as though the echoes of the previous evening still lingered in every corridor. Rosalie spent most of the afternoon in the library, unable to stop replaying Sebastian's words in her mind. Miss Whitmore is under my protection. No one had ever spoken for her like that before. Not her uncle. Not the society women who had smiled politely while whispering behind fans. Not even her father while he had been alive, because kindness had always come to Rosalie wrapped in apology rather than certainty. Yet Sebastian Ashford had defended her without hesitation. Quietly. Completely. The thought unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. Outside the library windows, snow drifted lazily from the gray sky, while the sea crashed far below the cliffs in restless waves. Rosalie sat curled near the fire with a book open in her lap, though she had not turned a single page in nearly an hour. Her mind wandered too easily toward the man whose footsteps occasionally echoed through the halls before vanishing again into silence. Toward evening, Mrs. Aldridge asked if Rosalie might help organize several unopened crates in one of the east storage rooms where old linens had been neglected for years. Grateful for distraction, Rosalie agreed immediately. The room itself was colder than the rest of the manor, hidden near the back corridors where fireplaces no longer burned regularly. Dust floated through narrow beams of fading daylight, while sheets covered forgotten furniture like pale ghosts. Rosalie climbed carefully onto a small wooden stool beside one of the cabinets, reaching upward to retrieve folded blankets from the highest shelf. Her fingers had barely brushed the fabric when the stool shifted unexpectedly beneath her feet. The sudden movement sent her tumbling sideways with a startled gasp. She managed to catch herself against the cabinet before striking the floor, but pain shot sharply through her arm as rough wood scraped against her sleeve. Miss Whitmore. Sebastian's voice cut through the silence instantly. Rosalie turned in surprise as he stepped into the doorway, his dark coat dusted lightly with snow from outside. His expression tightened the moment he saw her gripping the cabinet for balance. Are you hurt? It is nothing, she answered quickly, trying to steady herself. But as she lowered her arm, the torn fabric of her sleeve slipped slightly downward. Sebastian froze. Beneath the pale skin of Rosalie's forearm lingered faint yellowed bruises half hidden near her wrist. Old marks. Not recent, yet unmistakable. Rosalie immediately pulled the fabric back into place, her cheeks burning with humiliation. I am sorry, she whispered softly. I should have been more careful. Sebastian did not answer right away. The room had gone terribly still. Even the wind outside seemed distant now. Slowly, he crossed toward her, though he stopped several feet away as though afraid to startle her further. His eyes remained fixed on the place where the bruises had briefly shown. Who did that to you? The question was quiet. Too quiet. Rosalie looked away toward the dusty floorboards. It does not matter anymore. Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly. Miss Whitmore. She swallowed hard. My uncle lost his temper sometimes after drinking. Shame crawled through her chest as the words left her lips. She hated speaking them aloud, hated the pity that usually followed. But Sebastian did not pity her. Something far more dangerous flickered behind his eyes. Anger, cold and controlled. Rosalie had never seen emotion disturb his composure before, yet now his hands curled tightly at his sides beneath the dark leather gloves. "How long?" he asked. She forced herself to answer honestly. "Since my father died." Silence followed. Heavy. Breathing became difficult inside it. Then Sebastian looked toward the frost-covered windows as though struggling to master something inside himself. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded lower than before. "No one protected you." Rosalie blinked in surprise at the sadness hidden beneath the words. For the first time in years, someone seemed horrified not by her scars, but by the fact she had carried them alone. Something shifted inside Blackthorne Hall after that afternoon. It was not sudden enough for anyone to name aloud, yet the manor itself seemed to breathe differently in the days that followed. The silence remained, but it no longer felt entirely lifeless. Fires burned longer in the evenings. Curtains were opened more often to let pale winter sunlight touch forgotten corners of the estate. Even the servants moved with less caution, as though the heavy grief haunting the halls had loosened its grip by the smallest degree. Rosalie noticed these changes quietly while pretending not to. Sebastian remained distant in many ways. He still disappeared for hours into his study overlooking the cliffs. He still spoke little during meals. Yet the coldness surrounding him had softened into something gentler, something tired rather than cruel. One evening she entered the dining room expecting to eat alone as usual, only to find Sebastian already seated near the fireplace with a book resting beside his untouched glass of wine. For a brief moment, both seemed equally surprised by the other's presence. "I can return later," Rosalie offered softly. No, Sebastian closed the book calmly. "Please stay." The words were simple, but something in his voice carried unfamiliar hesitation, as though he had forgotten how to ask another person to remain near him. Rosalie took her seat carefully while servants brought supper beneath the warm glow of candlelight. Snow still drifted beyond the windows, but inside the room the fire crackled softly against the marble hearth. For several minutes they ate in silence. Yet unlike before, the quiet no longer felt sharp enough to wound. Sebastian finally looked toward her across the table. "Mrs. Aldridge informed me the east greenhouse lights were lit yesterday evening." Rosalie lowered her gaze slightly. "I hope I did not overstep." The plants inside were dying from neglect. Something almost resembling amusement flickered faintly in Sebastian's eyes. "You reopened a part of this house no one has entered in years." Rosalie folded her hands together. It seemed sad for something beautiful to be abandoned simply because no one looked at it anymore. The moment the words left her mouth, she realized what they truly sounded like. Sebastian understood too. Silence settled gently between them once more. Yet this time it carried recognition instead of distance. Later that evening, Rosalie wandered through the greenhouse after supper while snowflakes drifted softly against the glass ceiling overhead. The room smelled faintly of damp earth and winter roses, struggling to survive the season. Most of the plants had withered long ago, but several pale blooms still clung stubbornly to life near the far windows. She knelt beside one of the planters, carefully trimming dead branches with gardening shears left nearby. Evelyn loved these roses. Rosalie looked up quickly. Sebastian stood near the entrance, dark coat unbuttoned, one gloved hand resting loosely against the iron frame of the doorway. He stepped farther inside slowly, his eyes moving across the greenhouse with quiet disbelief. "She used to spend entire afternoons here," he continued softly, "even during winter." Rosalie glanced toward the fragile flowers between them. Then perhaps they survived because they were waiting for someone to remember them. Sebastian stared at her for a long moment after that. Candlelight from the nearby lantern reflected against his gray eyes, but beneath the exhaustion lingering there now lived something else. Awareness. He had spent years surrounding himself with silence because grief felt safer than hope. Yet somehow this quiet young woman with sorrow hidden beneath her sleeves had begun breathing warmth back into rooms he thought would remain frozen forever. Rosalie rose carefully from beside the roses. "I did not mean to disturb old memories, Your Grace." Sebastian shook his head once. "You are not disturbing them." His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "You are waking this house from them." Outside, Snow continued falling across the cliffs in endless white waves. But inside the greenhouse, among dying roses and candlelight, Sebastian Ashford looked at Rosalie Whitmore not as a burden left behind by another man's sins, but as the first living thing to return warmth to Blackthorne Hall in years. By the second week of Rosalie's stay at Blackthorne Hall, the storms had finally begun to loosen their grip on the cliffs. Pale sunlight occasionally pierced the heavy winter clouds, scattering silver across the frozen sea below the estate. Yet despite the clearing skies, Sebastian seemed more unsettled than before. Rosalie noticed it in the way he lingered silently at windows during supper, his thoughts far beyond the room around him. She noticed it in the tension beneath his calm whenever servants mentioned the nearby villages or deliveries arriving from town. It felt as though he were waiting for something unpleasant to reach the manor gates. The answer arrived just after dusk 3 nights later. Rosalie sat alone in the library beside the fire, carefully repairing the torn spine of an old poetry collection she had found abandoned among dusty shelves. The manor had grown unusually quiet after dinner. Somewhere deeper within the house, a grandfather clock chimed 8 slow times through the corridors. Then suddenly the sharp sound of raised voices echoed faintly from the entrance hall below. Rosalie froze. Blackthorne Hall rarely held noise louder than whispers. She rose carefully and stepped into the corridor just as Mrs. Aldridge hurried past with visible worry in her expression. "What has happened?" Rosalie asked softly. The housekeeper hesitated. "Your uncle has arrived." The word struck like ice water down Rosalie's spine. Before she could respond, another voice thundered upward from the lower floor. Theodore Whitmore. Even from a distance, the bitterness in his tone remained unmistakable. Rosalie's pulse quickened painfully as old fear tightened around her chest. Without thinking, she moved toward the staircase overlooking the grand entrance hall below. Sebastian stood near the center of the marble floor dressed in black evening clothes, his posture perfectly still despite the fury radiating from Theodore several feet away. Snow melted from Theodore's overcoat onto the polished stone while 2 nervous footmen lingered nearby. "You had no right interfering in my affairs," Theodore snapped harshly. "The girl belongs with her family." Sebastian's voice remained dangerously calm. "You forfeited the right to speak of family the moment you attempted to barter her life for your debts." Theodore gave a bitter laugh. "You think yourself noble now? You would not even know her name if I had not brought her here." Rosalie gripped the staircase railing tightly as humiliation burned through her. She hated hearing herself discussed again like property exchanged between men. Sebastian, however, did not look away from Theodore for even a second. "State your purpose and leave," he said coldly. Theodore's expression shifted then. Something calculating entered his eyes. "Very well. I came for compensation." Sebastian's jaw hardened slightly. Theodore continued. "A wealthy widower in Norfolk has recently expressed interest in Miss Whitmore. A count nearly twice her age, but generous enough to overlook her unfortunate circumstances." Rosalie felt sick. "He has offered a substantial arrangement in exchange for marriage." Silence crashed through the hall. Even the servants looked horrified. Theodore shrugged carelessly. "The girl should feel grateful. Few women in her position receive opportunities at all." Sebastian moved then. Not violently, not recklessly, but something terrifying entered the stillness surrounding him. He stepped forward once, and Theodore instinctively fell silent. "You attempted to sell her once already," Sebastian said quietly, "and now you would deliver her to another man for profit." Theodore lifted his chin defensively. "She is my responsibility." "No," the single word cut through the room like a blade. Sebastian's eyes darkened with restrained fury unlike anything Rosalie had ever seen. "She was never yours to trade." Theodore opened his mouth again, but Sebastian spoke first. "Leave Blackthorne Hall immediately." The command carried absolute authority. Theodore stared at him furiously before his gaze suddenly lifted toward the staircase. Toward Rosalie. "You see," he sneered bitterly. "You think he protects you because he cares? Men like him do not rescue women like you without wanting something in return." Shame and anger collided painfully inside her chest. Yet before Rosalie could react, Sebastian turned toward the staircase as well. Their eyes met across the candlelit hall. And in that moment, Rosalie saw something inside him she had not dared recognize before. Not obligation, not pity, something far more dangerous. because Sebastian Ashford looked at her like the thought of losing her had already become unbearable. The night after Theodore Whitmore was forced from Blackthorne Hall, Rosalie could not sleep. Wind rattled the tall windows of her chamber, while dying embers glowed faintly inside the fireplace, casting restless shadows across the walls. Theodore's words still echoed painfully inside her mind. Men like him do not rescue women like you without wanting something in return. She sat near the window wrapped in a wool blanket, staring out across the cliffs buried beneath moonlit snow. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorne Hall, fear no longer came from her uncle or the future awaiting her beyond these walls. It came from herself, from the dangerous warmth slowly taking root in a heart that had survived years by expecting nothing from anyone. Sebastian Ashford had become impossible to understand. He remained distant enough to preserve propriety, yet every action contradicted the cold image the world believed about him. He noticed when she looked tired. He listened when she spoke, even quietly. And tonight, when Theodore tried once more to treat her like a possession, Sebastian's anger had not come from pride. It had come from something deeply personal, that frightened her more than cruelty ever could. Before dawn, unable to endure the restless ache in her chest any longer, Rosalie made a decision. She would leave Blackthorne Hall as soon as the roads cleared fully. It was the only kindness she could still offer him. This house had already lost one woman Sebastian loved. She would not become another shadow haunting its halls. By morning, the storm clouds had finally broken apart completely, revealing pale winter sunlight stretching across the frozen sea. Rosalie spent the day quietly preparing for departure. Mrs. Aldridge noticed immediately. "You are packing," the housekeeper said softly upon entering the room. Rosalie folded another dress carefully into her small leather case. "The road should reopen within days." Mrs. Aldridge hesitated. "His Grace will not wish you to leave so soon." Pain flickered through Rosalie's chest at those words, but she forced a faint smile. "That is precisely why I must." The older woman studied her sadly, yet asked no further questions. Evening fell cold and silver across the estate. Rosalie waited until the manor grew quiet before slipping into the corridor with her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She intended to leave a letter for Sebastian in the library explaining her gratitude and apology for the trouble she had brought into his life. But as she descended the staircase leading toward the entrance hall, the sound of the front doors opening echoed through the silence below. Snow-laden wind swept briefly through the manor as Sebastian stepped inside from the cliffs, dark coat dusted with frost. He stopped the moment he saw her standing halfway down the staircase with gloves in her hands and tears she had not realized still shimmered in her eyes. "You are leaving." It was not a question. Rosalie swallowed hard. "I cannot remain here forever." Sebastian removed his gloves slowly, his expression unreadable beneath the pale chandelier light. "You believe your presence burdens me." Her voice trembled despite every effort to steady it. "Your life was peaceful before I arrived." Something sharp crossed his face then. "Peaceful?" He gave a quiet laugh entirely without humor. "Blackthorne Hall has not known peace in years." Rosalie's fingers tightened around the staircase railing. "People already whisper about me. About us." Sebastian climbed the stairs toward her then, one measured step at a time. Not hurried, not reckless. Yet each step closed the distance she had spent days trying desperately to preserve. "Let them whisper," he said quietly. Rosalie shook her head. "You do not understand. Men always take eventually. Protection, kindness. It always costs something." Sebastian stopped only a few feet below her now. Close enough for candlelight to catch the exhaustion in his gray eyes. Close enough for her to see the hurt hidden beneath his calm. "Rosalie." Her name sounded different in his voice. Softer, almost fragile. "You were never a debt to me." Silence wrapped around them while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. Sebastian's gaze never left hers. "You were the first honest thing brought into this house in a very long time." Rosalie's breath caught painfully in her throat. Because standing there beneath the dim golden light of Blackthorne Hall, she realized the man before her was no longer fighting only grief. He was fighting the terrifying possibility of hope. Word spread through the county faster than winter storms. By the end of the week, nearly every noble family surrounding Blackthorne Hall had heard some version of the same story. The feared Duke of Blackthorne was sheltering a disgraced young woman whose own uncle had attempted to trade her for debt relief. Some called Rosalie a victim. Others called her ambitious. Most simply whispered behind closed doors while pretending sympathy in public. Sebastian ignored the gossip entirely. But Rosalie could feel its weight growing heavier with each passing day. The invitations arriving at Blackthorne Hall became fewer. Servants returning from town exchanged uncomfortable glances whenever her name was mentioned. Even Mrs. Aldridge seemed troubled whenever letters bearing aristocratic seals appeared at breakfast. One icy morning, Sebastian entered the dining room carrying a cream-colored envelope already broken open in his hand. His expression remained calm, though something distant lingered behind his eyes. Rosalie set down her teacup carefully. Bad news. Sebastian looked toward her across the long table. Lord Ashcombe is hosting his annual winter gathering tomorrow evening. Rosalie recognized the name immediately. The Ashcombe estate held one of the largest social events in the county every season. Nobles traveled from neighboring cities simply to attend. Sebastian folded the invitation once before placing it beside his untouched coffee. Ordinarily, I would decline. Rosalie lowered her gaze. But this year they expect you to appear. Sebastian watched her quietly for a moment. They expect to see whether the rumors about Blackthorne Hall are true. Shame warmed her cheeks despite herself. Then you should go alone. Silence stretched between them. Then Sebastian said quietly, I intend to ask you to accompany me. Rosalie looked up immediately. Your Grace, no. Rosalie. The softness in his voice unsettled her more than command would have. You have hidden inside this manor for weeks because society decided your dignity was negotiable. I will not allow them to continue deciding your worth. Fear twisted painfully in her chest. You do not understand how cruel they can be. Sebastian's expression darkened slightly. I understand perfectly. The following evening, snow drifted gently across the countryside as Blackthorne Hall prepared for the first public appearance Sebastian Ashford had made in nearly 2 years. Servants moved quietly through the manor while candlelight reflected against polished marble and silver. Rosalie stood motionless before the mirror inside her room, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. Mrs. Aldridge had chosen a gown of deep midnight blue velvet that softened the sadness lingering beneath Rosalie's eyes instead of hiding it. A delicate silver comb pinned part of her chestnut hair away from her face. She looked elegant. Too elegant for a woman who still remembered what it felt like to be discussed as payment between drunken men. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sebastian waited outside her chamber, dressed in black formal attire, snowflakes melting slowly against the shoulders of his dark coat. For a brief moment neither spoke. His eyes moved toward her carefully, almost cautiously, as though beauty had become something dangerous to him long ago. You look lovely, he said at last. Rosalie's breath caught faintly. No one had ever spoken those words to her without expectation hidden beneath them. The ballroom at Ashcombe Manor glittered beneath enormous crystal chandeliers when they arrived later that evening. Music drifted through the crowded hall while noblemen and women dressed in silk and diamonds turned immediately toward the entrance. Conversations faltered. Fans stilled midair. Sebastian offered Rosalie his arm without hesitation as they entered together beneath hundreds of watching eyes. Whispers spread almost instantly through the room like fire catching dry paper. Rosalie felt every stare like cold rain against her skin, yet Sebastian remained perfectly composed beside her. Then Lady Hawthorne stepped forward through the crowd with a smile far too sharp to be kind. How brave of you to appear publicly after everything, she remarked sweetly to Rosalie. Several nearby nobles exchanged quiet laughs. One does wonder, Lady Hawthorne continued, whether Blackthorne Hall now offers charity or something rather less respectable. Humiliation crashed through Rosalie so suddenly she could barely breathe. Around them the ballroom had gone silent. Waiting. Watching. Sebastian looked at Lady Hawthorne for a long moment without speaking. Then before anyone could react, the Duke of Blackthorne stepped directly in front of Rosalie Whitmore and lowered himself onto one knee before the entire room. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Sebastian lifted his eyes to her steadily, openly, without shame. Then let every person here witness this clearly, he said quietly. There is no charity in choosing the woman who has become the most honorable part of my life. Silence swept through the Ashcombe ballroom after Sebastian's words like snow falling over shattered glass. No one moved. No one dared speak. The mighty Duke of Blackthorne still knelt before Rosalie Whitmore, while crystal chandeliers glowed above them, and the orchestra stood frozen mid-performance. Lady Hawthorne's painted smile had vanished completely. Around the room, noblemen exchanged stunned glances, while women lowered their fans with trembling fingers. Sebastian Ashford, the coldest man in 3 counties, had just offered a disgraced young woman something far greater than protection. He had offered her honor before all of society. Rosalie could barely breathe. Emotion rose so sharply inside her chest it hurt. She had spent years surviving humiliation quietly, teaching herself not to expect kindness because hope only made cruelty sharper when it arrived. Yet this man, this wounded, lonely duke who once buried himself inside grief and silence, was looking at her as though the entire world had narrowed to the space between them. Slowly, Rosalie extended her trembling hand toward him. Sebastian rose carefully to his feet, his gloved fingers closing gently around hers. Warmth spread through her chest at the simple touch. Not possession, not obligation. Choice. The orchestra resumed moments later, though the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. Whispers still followed them throughout the evening, but none carried open cruelty anymore. Sebastian's declaration had silenced even the cruelest among them. No one challenged the Duke of Blackthorne publicly, especially not when his gaze darkened at the slightest disrespect directed toward Rosalie. Hours later, their carriage finally departed Ashcombe Manor beneath falling snow and pale moonlight. Inside the quiet darkness of the carriage, neither spoke for several minutes. The events of the evening still lingered heavily between them. Rosalie sat wrapped in velvet and candle shadows while the wheels rolled steadily across frozen roads leading home. Home. The thought startled her, because somewhere along the way, Blackthorne Hall had begun feeling dangerously close to one. Sebastian broke the silence first. I regret exposing you to that room tonight. Rosalie looked toward him immediately. You defended me. His jaw tightened slightly. You should never have needed defending. The quiet sadness in his voice unsettled her more deeply than anger could have. Rosalie lowered her gaze toward her gloved hands. All my life I believed surviving quietly was enough. Sebastian watched her carefully across the dim carriage light. And now? She hesitated before answering honestly. Now I think perhaps surviving is not the same as living. Something softened in his expression then. Something almost unbearably tender. The carriage arrived at Blackthorne Hall shortly before midnight. Snow drifted peacefully across the cliffs while servants hurried forward carrying lanterns through the darkness. As Rosalie stepped from the carriage, Mrs. Aldridge appeared in the entrance hall holding a small wooden box wrapped carefully in faded blue cloth. This arrived earlier today from Whitmore Manor, the housekeeper explained softly. One of the old servants delivered it privately. Rosalie frowned slightly. For me? Mrs. Aldridge nodded. He said it belonged to your father. Hours later, unable to sleep, Rosalie sat alone beside the fireplace in the library with the small box resting unopened in her lap. The fire crackled softly while moonlight shimmered faintly through the tall windows overlooking the sea. At last she loosened the ribbon and lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay several letters tied together with worn string, along with a silver pocket watch she recognized instantly as her father's. Tears stung her eyes before she even unfolded the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's steady, careful script filled the yellowed paper beneath the firelight. Rosalie read silently at first, then slowly her breath caught. Sebastian Ashford, she whispered aloud. Footsteps paused suddenly behind her. She turned to find Sebastian standing motionless near the doorway, his expression tightening at the sound of his own name spoken from her lips. Rosalie looked back down at the trembling letter in her hands. My father knew yours. Sebastian's eyes darkened with confusion. Rosalie swallowed hard as emotion threatened to overwhelm her completely. According to this letter, years ago during the winter fever outbreak in Blackthorne Village, my father saved the Duke of Blackthorne's life. Silence filled the library. Deep. Endless. Sebastian stared at her as though the world itself had shifted beneath his feet, because suddenly their meeting no longer felt accidental. It felt like fate had begun weaving their lives together long before either of them understood what they would someday become to each other. Winter slowly released its hold over Blackthorne Hall in the weeks that followed. Snow still rested along the cliffs in pale silver patches, but the sea below no longer looked angry. Morning sunlight touched the manor more often now, spilling through tall windows and warming corridors that had once existed only in shadow. Servants laughed quietly again, while carrying fresh flowers through the halls. Fires burned later into the evenings. The greenhouse bloomed with stubborn winter roses beneath glass ceilings covered in melting frost. It felt as though the entire estate had awakened from mourning alongside the man who ruled it. Sebastian changed most of all. Not loudly, not suddenly. He remained reserved before others, still carrying grief in the quiet corners of his expression. But Rosalie began noticing the smallest impossible things. He smiled now, though rarely, and only for seconds at a time. He lingered beside her during supper instead of disappearing immediately afterward. Some evenings they sat together in the library while she read aloud softly beside the fire, and he simply listened in silence, his eyes fixed not on the pages but on her voice filling the room. The loneliness surrounding him had not vanished completely, yet it no longer owned him. One evening near the end of February, Rosalie stood beside the great windows overlooking the cliffs while snow fell gently into the dark sea below. Candlelight flickered behind her throughout the library, painting the room in soft gold and shadow. She held her father's final letter carefully between her fingers, rereading the closing lines once more. Your mother once told me that some souls are guided toward each other long before they meet. If ever hardship finds you, Rosie, trust the people who bring warmth back into your life rather than fear. Tears blurred her vision slightly. He sounds like a wise man. Rosalie turned softly at Sebastian's voice. He stood near the doorway dressed simply in black wool, one hand resting against the frame, while snowlight silvered the strands of dark hair near his temples. Rosalie smiled faintly. He believed kindness mattered more than pride. Sebastian walked slowly toward her until only the warmth of the fire separated them. Then I suspect I would have admired him greatly. Silence settled gently between them. Comfortable now. Familiar. Rosalie looked down at the letter before whispering, I spent so many years believing my life would become smaller with time. Sebastian's brow furrowed slightly. Smaller. Lonelier, she admitted softly. Like something fragile the world would eventually wear down completely. His expression changed then. Not pity. Never pity. Something deeper. Rosalie. The way he spoke her name still unraveled something tender inside her chest every time. Sebastian reached toward her slowly, giving her every chance to step away. But she did not. His gloved fingers brushed gently against her hand, steady and warm. You survived people who tried to convince you that your worth depended on what they could take from you, he said quietly. And somehow you remained kind anyway. Emotion tightened painfully in Rosalie's throat. Outside the windows, snow drifted endlessly across the cliffs beneath the darkening sky. Inside the library, candlelight trembled softly against old books and stone walls that no longer felt haunted. Sebastian lifted her hand carefully to his lips, pressing the gentlest kiss against her knuckles. Not ownership, not possession, reverence. Rosalie closed her eyes briefly as tears threatened again. Because after everything the world had done to both of them, neither had expected tenderness to survive inside their hearts. Yet somehow it had. The grandfather clock chimed softly somewhere deep within Blackthorne Hall, while the fire crackled beside them. For the first time in years, Sebastian Ashford no longer looked like a man buried beside old grief. And Rosalie Whitmore no longer looked like someone waiting quietly to be abandoned. Together they stood before the snow-covered sea while warmth filled the once empty halls around them. Some souls are not rescued from death. They are rescued from the terrible belief that they were never worth loving at all.